Shelley Emling. I'm Shelley Emling, the editor of the Girlfriend newsletter. I'm also the moderator of the Girlfriend Book Club. And tonight is our monthly discussion of Lady Tan's Circle of Women, which you all, the nearly 70,000 members of the Girlfriend Book Club, chose as our December book club pick. And I'm so pleased that you did. This book was also chosen by you all as we did an annual poll like we do every year of our favorite books of the year of 2023. And you also chose this book as the number one Girlfriend Book Club pick for 2023. So it's such an honor tonight to welcome Lisa See., the author, to join us. She's written, I think, 11 or 12 books. I might be off on that, but some really memorable books like Shanghai Girls, and she's a very famous best-selling author. We're so happy to have her here with us tonight. So welcome, Lisa.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's so nice to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here.
So first off, I just wanted to ask you a little bit of, before we get into the book, which is amazing, I want to ask you a little bit about your history and your background, where you grew up, just a little bit about where did you always want to be a writer, that sort of thing.
So I grew up in Los Angeles. I'm actually fifth generation. I happened to be born in Paris, but came.
I saw that, yeah.
My parents were, students, and I lived in a dresser drawer for 6 weeks, and then we came home. And my mother's family was very small. My father's family in Los Angeles was huge. This was the Chinese side of my family. My great-great-grandfather had come to work on the railroad. My great-grandfather came and stayed and became kind of the godfather patriarch of Los Angeles Chinatown. So when I was a little kid, I had about 400 relatives in Los Angeles.
Oh my gosh.
On that side of the family, about a dozen that looked like me, the majority still full Chinese, and then this spectrum in between. And so when I was a kid and I looked around me, what I saw were Chinese faces. What I experienced was Chinese culture, Chinese tradition, Chinese language, and of course, Chinese food. And that's why I write the kinds of books that I do.
So I read that you came up with the idea, and everybody wants to know, where did you come up with the idea for this book? But I read in previous interviews that you said you saw a book on your shelf, one of your bookshelves, about pregnancy in the during the Ming Dynasty. And you hadn't read it before. You grabbed it off the shelf and looked at it. And within 26 hours, you knew what book you were going to write next. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I actually had thought I was going to be writing a different book, but I couldn't possibly do that during the pandemic. That book was going to require a trip deep, deep, deep into a very, very remote part of China. Absolutely no way to do that in 2020 or even 2021 or 2022. So, that just had to be completely shelved. And I kind of moped around the house for many months because I couldn't do what I do. Not only was China closed, but all the research libraries, the archives, everything. Anyway, it wasn't until October of 2020 that I was walking through my office, and I have a whole wall of research books, and the spine of them one just kind of popped out at me. And I really do feel like it practically jumped off the shelf into my hands.
It spoke to you.
Yeah, Reproducing Women, Pregnancy and Childbirth in the Ming Dynasty. And as you pointed out, yes, I'd had it on my shelf a long time, 10 years. I not only had never opened it, I'd not read it, I'd never even opened it, but I thought, now's the time. And I sat down right then and I got to page 19, and there was this mention of this woman doctor in the Ming Dynasty who, when she turned 50 in 1511, published a book of her medical cases. And I just thought, oh, that's interesting. I set the book down, went to my computer to look her up, and discovered that her book was still in print, not just in Chinese, but also in English. And although I am a huge supporter of independent bookstores, on that day I may have ordered it from Amazon, and I had it within 24 hours. And I like you said, it was all of about 26 hours that I knew that this was the book that I needed to write.
Does that happen with had that happened before with your other books?
Yeah, I mean, most of my books, I've thought about them 5 years. Island of Sea Women, my last one was 8 years. The one before that, 20 years. Wow. So I usually think about things for a really long time before I decide this is the one.
So when I asked the members of the book club what did they want me to ask you, the number one question over and over again was, "How did you research this book?" Because the research, it's
Right.
so detailed. You're so in depth, and you obviously you had to research jewelry and clothing and everything. I mean, how in the world would you go about researching a book like this?
Well, again, everything was closed, right? So I really had to approach the research in a very different way. And I did several different things. One was I kind of put together an imaginary pot of money that would have been the money that I would have spent on a research trip to China, the airfare, the hotels, transportation, food.
Right.
And I used that to buy books that I couldn't get from the library, and a lot of them rare, very hard to find. In fact, the very first one that I looked for, the first copy I found was over $1,000. I eventually found a copy for about 125, but in terrible condition. But I didn't need it to be in good condition. I wasn't buying it as a collector. I just needed what the information inside. So that was one thing I did. The other is that I reached out directly to a lot of scholars, and they were so generous with their time, with their information that they gave me, with the people that they would say, "Oh, now you need to go talk to so and so." All of this on Zoom. And remember, Zoom was still new to everybody.
Exactly.
And I think that there was an aspect to this that they were kind of going through the same things that we all were going through at that time, which is, I'm in my house. Now what? Months have gone by. Now what? I can't do what I do. Now what? Oh, here's this woman who wants to talk to me about the Ming Dynasty, or she wants to talk to me about how to travel from this town of Wuxi to Beijing in 1496. What is the mail system like? Was there a mail system? Oh, I found somebody who, for the last 10 years, had been researching the mail system of the Ming Dynasty. And I kind of, think about his wife. She must have been in the other room thinking, thank goodness there's someone else who can listen to this for a while.
That's funny. So I always ask this of authors. Was there a particular character or chapter or scene or time in the book that was really challenging to write more so than the others? Or was there something that really took a lot out of you?
Well, I have to say there were a lot of things in this book that took a lot out of me. Uh, and actually, just even starting at the beginning with the death of Tan Yunshen's mother.
Right.
And, as a little girl, how she experiences that and what she understands and what she doesn't understand. And of course, as the writer, as an adult, as a woman, I can understand what was happening in a way she couldn't. And so that scene, I think, in that first chapter really set the tone for what was to come, because this, really is so much about women's health, how women, reproductive health, particularly what it was like to give birth in the Ming Dynasty. This was a very difficult time, and male doctors couldn't even see women. So the male doctors were trying to figure out how these women's bodies worked when they couldn't even see them or touch them. And so there were a lot of things like that were quite difficult. To me, Mailing's miscarriage and what happens to her after that, that was just heartbreaking to me, and how she punishes herself.
I apologize for my dog barking in the background. There's nothing I could do. There's nobody here to stop the dog. Sorry.
I love it. It means we're live.
To do.
But what I wanted to say about that particular scene where she miscarries, that's actually based on the true story of a woman named Midwife Peng. Mei Ling is a fictional character, but Midwife Peng lived. She did miscarry in front of the empress, who was known as the Compassionate One. The emperor did order her to be decapitated, and the empress pulled herself out of bed, and with all the ladies of the court went to the emperor and begged to save this woman's life, and he did. But, she did have those other punishments, which were so violent and terrible. But that was all of that, anything that happened in the story that I knew had happened to someone real, that's always much harder for me than if I'm just making it up, because that's just a fictional person. But to actually think this was a real person who went through this.
So the other question they wanted me to ask you was, did you have any background or in Chinese medicine before you did this book? Um, did you have to learn everything? I guess you did pretty much.
Well, so actually, my great-great-grandfather who came to work on the railroad was an herbalist. That's what he was hired to do. I mean, he was also a manual laborer, but he, in those days, they needed Chinese doctors to treat the Chinese laborers. So for my very first book, which is about my own family history, it tells the history of the Chinese in America through the eyes of my family. I'd done quite a bit of research then, but I've also, been going to traditional Chinese medicine doctors since I was 19. I still do. I mean, I see Western doctors as well, but I think there's a place to combine both of these things. And my grandparents, there's so much with traditional Chinese medicine that just has to do with the food you eat day to day, and the seasons, and what foods you should eat during each season, and the special mother's soup, things like that when you give birth that you eat. And so when I was a kid, I don't know how aware I was of what my grandparents were feeding me, but I know that they did pay attention to that. And when I had my children, my grandmother and aunt, great aunt, got together to make the special mother's soup and bring it to me.
So I know that one quick thing in the acknowledgments of the book, I know you said that terms like child palace for the uterus, that's actually something that's still, those terms are still used in contemporary China. That's true, right? That's
correct.
That's amazing. Okay. And I know that you also
a much nicer term.
That is a nicer term. I did like it, child's palace. I thought that was, and several of the terms you used were quite nice. So during the pandemic, I know you mentioned before we got on this interview, you said that this was a sort of a quiet time in your life, or a quiet time in when we're the age that we are in a woman's life, to kind of maybe take a pause and look around. Can you expand on that?
So, the book is divided into those 4 sections. Milk years, hairpinning days, rice and salt days, and then sitting quietly. And these were the 4 traditional periods in a woman's life. And I think that they still relate to us today. When you're a little milk years, when you're a little kid, hairpinning days, where you're, a teenager in your 20s, you're dressing up, you're doing your hair, you're going out, you're hopefully looking for your significant other, whoever that is. And then the rice and salt days, those days of, especially if you're married and have children, not everybody does, but the amount of sort of chores that are involved in that. And then, this traditional time of sitting quietly, which we would call menopause, I suppose. But the idea was to be sitting quietly. But for so many women, whether it was in the past or now, that actually becomes a time of having more freedom, more time to do what you want to do. All those, you don't have to pack lunches for your kids. You don't need to make sure they're getting their, doing their homework. You're not overseeing whether they're getting into a good school, all of those kinds of things that's behind you now. And so you can really start to focus more on yourself. And she did that, Tanya Shen, in real life. To me, it's, I love the fact that she published this book when she turned 51. So she's just at that beginning of that time. And that in real life, I don't go into it in the novel, but that was the turning point, a big turning point for her, where her whole life opened up in many, many different ways. And I just feel like there's something that we can learn from that we still do today.
So what is your writing routine like on a daily basis? You've written many, many books. You're very famous. What is your day-to-day? How do you structure your day? Do you get up at a certain time and make sure you write 8 hours a day or 4 hours and take a break, or what's your routine like?
So a book typically takes me about 2 years. The
Okay.
majority of time is spent on the research. I mean, vast majority of the time. The writing is actually the least amount of time, and the
Oh,
editing is somewhere in the middle. So when I'm doing research, this is the part that I absolutely love. To me, it's like a treasure hunt. I can do that all day and then some. I mean, I
right.
just love it. And I do it all myself. I never know what I'm going to find. And for me, again, it is like a treasure hunt. So when I, for example, came across the story of the worm, I
Mhm.
was just like, I've got to use that. I'm going to use that. That's a real story, that happened to a real woman in that time. And so for me, it's sort of, well, where does that come? Is it at the beginning, the middle, the end? Why is it there? What's the ripple effect?
Right.
So that's the research. When I start writing, um, I write 1,000 words a day, which is just 4 pages.
Mhm.
And sometimes I can do that in about 2 hours, and sometimes it can take me 8 or 10. If it
Right.
takes me 8 or 10, I know it's not very good. It's like, and I keep a notebook where I actually keep track of how many words I've done. And sometimes I'll be at like 987. And I'm just like, I just need
Can't
13
do it.
more. But no one's going to have dinner until I get to that 1,000. But I can't, you can't fix something unless there's something already on the page. So I just, even if it's not good, I keep going.
Right.
And I write from the page. Well, I do write the last sentence first for every book.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I
And
did
then
not know that. I didn't read that anywhere today. Okay.
I start at page one and go all the way to the end. And often the last sentence isn't all that significant, really. It's nothing mind blowing, but I know what it means to me emotionally. And so, these characters, I have to admit, they go through a lot.
Right.
There's a lot of bumps along the way. But for me, it's like it's the light at the end of the tunnel. It's the emotional place that I want to end up that usually is a happy one. I like to have a happy or happy-ish ending.
So I'm getting a note that a lot of people want me to ask you about the feet binding issue practice in China. That a lot of people that read this book, I don't think had ever known about that before. Is there anything you can say about that? I imagine you had known about this before you started writing the book.
I mean, I have written about it in different books. In Snowflower and the Secret Fan, I really wrote about it from a child's perspective as it's happening to her. In Peony and Love, I really thought about just from a mother's perspective. But this time, I really wanted to sort of show how, once you get past that foot binding itself,
Mhm.
this is still a lifelong project.
Right.
You could die many, many years later from an infection. You can, fall, break your leg. They didn't, they didn't have the kind of medicine we have today. So I think the thing to think about, or maybe what they're asking could be, is like, how did it start? Should I
Yeah.
talk about that for a second? So
Sure.
about 1,000 years ago, there was a woman who was a dancer, and it was said she wrapped her feet, and when she danced, it looked like she had little fox feet.
Mhm.
When I hear that, I think of like maybe it was like ballet slip, toe shoes. And she became hugely popular for this. And so all the men came to see her, with the result that then other courtesans started binding their feet, with the result that all the men went to see them, with the result that there were a bunch of women at home saying the Chinese equivalent of, how am I going to get Harry to come home? And that's how it made that jump from the
Right.
courtesan culture into the culture of fine, upstanding women.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Um,
didn't know that.
and then why it lasted, there's so many reasons. One, it was an incredible economic status symbol for men. I
Mhm.
am so wealthy that, look, my wife has bound feet. I mean,
Right.
she didn't have to work.
Huh.
I am so wealthy that not only does my wife have bound feet, but even our servants have bound feet.
Hmm.
That was a really wealthy man.
Wow.
And men are men, so there was a whole sexual component to bound feet. But, other things. A woman will always have to lean on a man. A woman can't run away. But this still doesn't explain how it could have lasted so long, passed from mother to daughter, generation after generation for
Yeah.
1,000 years. This was the one thing a mother could do to possibly give her daughter a better chance at life. She could give her daughter a pair of perfectly bound feet, then she might be able to marry into a better family. So, the other alternatives, she could be working in the fields. Until very recently, like 30 years ago in China, the life expectancy for a Chinese peasant was only about 45 years. And that's only 30 years ago. It
Mhm.
was very hard life, physically demanding and really tough conditions with not enough food. You could be sold by your family to become a concubine, a courtesan, a prostitute, a lesser wife, third, fourth, fifth wife. You don't have any choice here. You have been bought and sold. And so if you're unhappy, that's too bad. You're just a piece of property. And then the last was to become a little daughter-in-law. And we did have some of these in the Chinese side of my family, when a poor family would sell their daughter, a little 5-year-old daughter to another family where she would do little chores around the house. But as she grew up, her job was really to be the sexual plaything of the men and boys in the household. And so if these are the only choices you have, but you could find your daughter's feet and maybe she marries into a better family and has a better life, then what would you do?
Right. I did not know all that. The other thing they wanted me to ask you about, and then I've got just a couple more questions really quick to wrap up, but the marriage bed, what was that exactly? I think I read somewhere in an interview that your grandparents had a
Yeah,
marriage
we
bed.
still have one in our family. My great great. I mean, we have a family store that's been in existence here in California for well over 130 years, something like that. And this is all Chinese antiques. But one of the things is this traditional Chinese marriage bed, and this was something for an elite family. And part of a woman's dowry, and it would travel with her to her husband's home and be put together. Most of them had just a simple sleeping platform with 4 kind of carved walls just to provide some privacy for the
Right.
couple. The one in my family actually is 3 rooms, and as it's described in the book is how it is. There's very elaborately carved out of about 20 different types of wood. The first room where the servant slept on the floor in case you needed anything in the night. The next one, the dressing room, and then through this moon gate onto the sleeping platform that was is surrounded on all sides with paintings on silk showing scenes of a happy couple together walking by the street and whatever. And so so the marriage bed, this is the first time an object has inspired me for one of my books. And so it was really nice to include that, something that when I was a child, this was my playhouse, where I played with all my cousins, where my sons played with their cousins. And once we all get enough grandchildren, where we hope that they'll all play there too. And I do have photos of it on my website.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yes, there's a section called Step Inside the World of Lady Tan. And there's
Oh,
a whole thing about this particular marriage bed, but then just marriage beds in general, but with lots of
good to know.
little detailed photos and stuff.
So just maybe 3 more questions, because we're running out of time. But what I always ask, what authors inspire you, or what book has wowed you lately that you could recommend? Or
Does it have to be lately?
no, no, no. In the
The one book that has inspired me for such a long time is Wallace Stegner's Angle of Repose.
oh,
And I actually used a couple of lines from that in my very first book as the epigraph. Fooling around in the papers my grandparents, especially my grandmother, left behind. I get glimpses of lives close to mine. I wish I could live in their clothes a while. And I didn't realize when I used that for my first book that that idea of living in their clothes a while is what would inspire me in my writing all the way to today.
Right. And so what are you working on now? What's next? And you may not be
So
able to talk about it, but
I can talk about it because I was, worked on it a little bit today. Not quite 1,000 words. I might have to go back in there a little bit.
you still have time.
I'm actually 5 words short of 1,000 words. But this has, as part of its historic backdrop, the 1871 Los Angeles Chinatown Massacre.
Oh,
And this is Los Angeles was tiny at that time, only 5,000 people. It was considered to be the wildest of all the Wild West towns, just dusty little pueblo. And 10% of the population killed 10% of the Chinese by stabbing, shooting, and lynching them. And it is considered to be one of the largest mass lynchings in the history of our country, certainly the largest in California. And I'm telling this story from the perspective of 3 women, Chinese women, who lived through that time. All of them real. And there were only 34 Chinese women there. And I just think about that, to just be the 3 out of the 34 in this dusty, crazy, violent town.
And so for somebody that's just read Lady Tan's Circle of Women and they didn't know your work before, which I find hard to believe, but say they didn't, is there one of your previous books, if they want to read something else by you next, is there a book you would recommend to people?
I'm going to give 2 recommendations. The one that is the most popular of all my books worldwide is Snowflower and the Secret Fan. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that one. But the other one is actually just my last one, The Island of Sea Women, which takes place in South Korea. And it's about the Haenyeo, these free diving women on this one island called Jeju, who for hundreds of years, they have been free divers. They take deep breaths, they dive down deep, 60 feet, deep enough to get the bends on a single breath, harvest seafood. They're the breadwinners in their families, and their husbands are the ones who stay home, take care of the kids, do the cooking, clean the house.
So 2 kind of personal questions at the end here. I read that you met your husband on a blind date. Is that true?
Set up by our parents.
So it worked out.
And we were engaged 10 weeks later.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. So it was love at first sight.
It truly was.
Wow. And finally, I always ask this other question. The Girlfriend is all about female friendship and the importance of female friendship, especially as you get older. So I just, besides reading, writing, your profession, your hobbies, what do you love to do with your girlfriends for fun?
Play tennis is, I think, the number one thing. I love tennis, and I'd love to hike with a friend or walk with a friend. I think anytime I can be outside is a wonderful thing, and it's, gives you time to talk, plus get a little exercise and listen to the birds.
I agree. I love walking with girlfriends. That's my favorite thing.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like people to take away from the book or know about the book, Lady Tan's Circle of Women, before we close?
I think you really had touched on this at the very end here, how important it is for us to have these circles. And we have all kinds of different circles in our lives, some that relate to our kids, or some that work, and some, that tennis, whatever it is
Right.
And we get so much from that. We get support and love and laughter, and yet there are these moments of the dark shadow sides as well. And even though there are those dark shadows in there, I just think how lucky we are that we have the freedom and the space and the mobility to create the circles around us.
That's so important. So thank you so much. It's been a delight talking to you, Lisa See., author of Lady Tan's Circle of Women. I just want to remind everybody that our book club pick for January is The Spectacular, and Fiona Davis will be joining us on January the 16th. Our book for February is The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, and James McBride will be joining us on February 20th. I have yet to read these two books, but I heard they're both great. Everybody in the Girlfriend Book Club, please stay on the Girlfriend Book Club page, because I'll be posting several conversation starters so that you can talk about Lady Tan's Circle of Women amongst yourselves. Anyway, thank you so much, Lisa. It was such a delight to meet you and to talk to you tonight. And thank you. And I know that the whole Girlfriend Book Club is so thrilled to hear from you. So have a wonderful evening and a great holiday season.
Same to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.